Okay, moving on to the next segment of today's show. This was a very eventful week in the SEC in terms of college basketball. And the first game I wanted to talk about in the SEC that took place this weekend was the battle between Tennessee and Alabama. And the Crimson Tide went into Knoxville and ended up getting the victory over Tennessee by a final score of 71-63. And I have a lot of things to say about this game. Now, going into this game, Tennessee was a team that I was very high on, and I'm still very high on them. If you watch them on Wednesday night, they absolutely dominated Missouri in a big-time road win, and that was a really impressive effort. And if Tennessee would have beaten Alabama on Saturday, I would have been all set to come on this show, talk about the Volunteers and just how impressive they are, and I still think they're very impressive. I still think they're one of the 5 to 7 best teams in college basketball. I still think they're one of the teams to beat in terms of a national championship, and right now when you look at the SEC, they are still, in my opinion, the best team in that league. But I wanted to talk during this segment about Alabama and just how meaningful this win was for them. And if you remember, Nate Oatts, going into the 2019-2020 season, he was hired to be the head coach at the University of Alabama. And Avery Johnson and his departure was something that was a little bit unexpected, but if you followed the Alabama program and the trajectory that they were going in, it wasn't the most crazy thing that has happened. Alabama over the last couple years has been teams that before Nate Oatts even got there, they've always been a team full of talent, but they've never really been able to win and get the job done with that talent. If you remember, they had Colin Sexton a couple years ago, and he's tearing it up in the NBA right now with the Cleveland Cavaliers, and all Alabama could do was win an NCAA tournament game, which is good, be an 8 seed, but I do feel like if you ask most Alabama fans, their expectations for that season would have been a little higher. I think the same thing could be said about the team that Avery Johnson had during his last year with Kyra Lewis, with John Petty, and guys like that, and unfortunately, that team wasn't able to break through and make the NCAA tournament. Last year was Nate Oatts' first year, though, and Nate Oatts is a guy that when he was the head coach at the University of Buffalo, he was considered to be one of the best mid-major coaches. If you remember, he knocked DeAndre Ayton and the Arizona Wildcats out of the NCAA tournament. He led the Buffalo Bulls to a round of 32 appearance in the following year, and they were one of the better and most consistent teams in college basketball during that season. But after that year, he ended up going and taking over as the new head coach at Alabama. And I think we all agreed that when Nate Oatts was hired, he was a guy that was a very good basketball coach from the X's and O's perspective. He was a guy that did great work at Buffalo, and many people considered him to be one of the best head coaching hires that was made during that offseason. However, there were a couple concerns for Nate Oatts. Obviously, recruiting was one of them. He is a guy that didn't really have that many connections down south. He is from the Wisconsin area, I believe, up north in Big Ten country. So there were a lot of people that were questioning whether he would be able to recruit and bring in talent to Alabama, just like Avery Johnson was able to do. But at the same time, the optimism that came from the University of Alabama was the fact that Nate Oatts is a really good basketball coach. He seemed like to be a really good leader of men while he was the head coach at Buffalo. He seemed like a really good mentor. And going into this season, I was looking forward to seeing what Alabama could be able to do for a couple reasons. Number one, when you look at this program and the way it's been built, this is a team filled with mostly Nate Oatts guys. They did have a couple players transfer during this past offseason, including Javen Davis and Galen Smith, guys that were here before Nate Oatts took over. And they brought in some guys like a Josh Primo, like a Jordan Brunner, that were single-handedly brought in by Nate Oatts. And Nate Oatts and this Alabama team has some talent. So that was a story that Alabama fans have seen before. They were just curious to see if Nate Oatts, as a head coach with that talent and with his second year in this new system, the Alabama fans were curious to see, okay, how exactly could we go? How far could we go? Can this team actually look like a legitimate contender and play that fast, fun style of basketball that they were able to play last year? And let's not forget, Alabama towards the back end of last season, actually started to play some really good basketball, and they probably would have not made the NCAA tournament, but I would have been very curious to see how exactly they would have done if they would have made an NIT, or just would have at least gotten a little bit more of an opportunity to play in some kind of tournament and just more time to gel out that chemistry. But obviously that didn't happen. But going into this season, they brought in some new dudes. You start off with Javon Quinterly. He was a transfer from Villanova, very talented player, and let's just face facts. It didn't work out at Villanova. Playing for Jay Wright just wasn't the best fit for him, and I was going to be very curious to see, while playing here at Alabama, what could he do? Is Nate Oatts going to put the ball in his hands and really let him go, or is he going to have to adjust to a new role? And I got to be honest with you, I've been really impressed with what Jelly, as they like to call him, has been doing over the last couple games for this Alabama team. In this game against Tennessee, he did have 10 points along with 6 assists, going only 4 of 13 from the field. You would obviously want to see him be a little more efficient there. But after losing a guy in Kyra Lewis, who was a lottery pick and was so important to everything that this Alabama team was able to do, I was impressed with the way Quinterly has came in and played well. But here's the crazy thing. It's not like Quinterly was even starting this game. Alabama used the starting lineup of Shackelford and then the freshman Primo at the 2, Petty, Herbert, Jones, and Bruner. And I think that there's a possibility that that rotation could be the best one for Alabama to use going forward, maybe with Quinterly as that 6th man and playing that role if he's good with it. And I feel like that question, if he's good with it, those are going to be the questions that Nate Oatts is ultimately going to have to answer, because if he found something in the starting lineup with Primo and Shackelford in the backcourt primarily, I'm going to be curious to see what exactly Nate Oatts will do playing and rearranging that lineup with Quinterly. And I actually watched Alabama on, I believe it was Tuesday night. They took on Ole Miss at home, really big game, and I was impressed with the way they played. They took a couple punches from Ole Miss early, and then were really able to set in and dominate that game, and that was a really good win. That was a really good start for a team like Alabama, because Ole Miss was a team that they've been competing against in SEC play. Ole Miss is a team that, going into this game against Tennessee, I would have liked to consider maybe on a similar level at the very least, to Alabama, and they really just took it to Ole Miss. They dominated that game, and that game to me seemed over by the second half. But then in this game, Alabama's going on the road against the Tennessee team that has been playing some really good basketball over the last couple weeks. They hadn't lost yet, and they're one of the best defensive teams in the country. And the fact that we saw Nate Oatts and Alabama really execute their game plan, and Nate Oatts realized, look, the only way for us to win this game is to speed up their defense, make some threes, and maybe just get a little lucky, have some luck. And Alabama was able to execute that perfectly. They were running all over the floor. They were hitting threes. I don't want to say they got lucky, but they got a little bit of a benefit, and that's what happens. Tennessee's offense was not great, and that's what good teams do. Alabama was really able to take advantage of Tennessee's mistakes, and that's what good teams do. It was 31-29 at the half. Alabama in the first half, the Tide only shot 2 of 9 from 3, but they were head-to-head with them in rebounding. However, in the second half, that's when Alabama really was able to take off. They had a 14-point lead within the first 6 minutes of the second half, and they shot 7 of 8 from 3 in the second half. And Jaden Shackelford, he hit the big 3 with 2:07 left to give Alabama a 9-point lead and some breathing room to hold off the Vols. And one thing that Nate Oatts said that really stood out to me was our offense wasn't very good in the last 8 minutes. We really won the game on the defensive end. And I think if you're an Alabama fan, that quote has to mean a lot to you, because when Nate Oatts was hired, what was one of the biggest concerns, not only Alabama, but a lot of other college basketball fans felt about the hire? Yeah, it was great. The only issue was it's kind of a similar situation to Shaka Smart and his first couple years at Texas. What made Nate Oatts so good and so successful while he was the head coach at Buffalo was he recruited his guys, and he recruited guys that were willing to dive on the floor, that were willing to play tough and dirty. If you remember, Buffalo would wear hard hats before the game and stuff like that. And when you recruit big-time players, sometimes it's hard to get all of them to buy in to that defensive rugged system, and it's funny because in the second half, more specifically in the last 8 minutes of the game, especially against elite defensive team like Tennessee, I was really impressed that Alabama was the better defensive team to close out the last 8 minutes of those games. Also, John Petty came off the bench in that win for Alabama against Ole Miss, and he connected on all 4 of his 3-point attempts and had 19 points, which ended up being the leading scorer for the game for Alabama. And if you could see, John Petty, throughout his career, a 4-year senior, he's been very boom or bust. If he is making shots, then that is just such a huge difference maker for Alabama. He's a very hot and cold kind of player, and we saw when he gets hot just how effective John Petty could be. And when you look at Josh Primo, that's another guy. Starting for the 3rd straight game, he shot 3 of 5 from 3. He is still a super young player, and he started for the 2nd game in a row over Javon Quinterly. And here's the crazy thing. Quinterly scored 24 points off the bench against Ole Miss. And still, Nate Oatts was like, okay, that could work. We're going to go back to Primo, and that's going to be our starting lineup going forward. And if you're an Alabama fan, there's no denying that it has really worked out so far. And Alabama, their next game is going to be huge. They take on a very good Florida team who is the only other 2-0 team in the SEC in Tuscaloosa. And it's crazy because historically, Alabama basketball has never played well against Florida at Coleman Coliseum. It's some crazy stat that Alabama just has not beaten Florida at home in a very long time. And if they could go out there and beat Florida and become the only 3-0 team in the SEC, that would be super, super impressive. And it's time to start paying attention to Nate Oatts and his squad. They looked very good in their win against Tennessee, looked very good in their win against Ole Miss, and they play one of the most fun, exciting styles of basketball. And they're deep, so if Alabama could keep this thing going, Nate Oatts and his squad are definitely something to watch going forward.